Well, thank you. It is a real pleasure to be here tonight with all of you. And as Andrew mentioned, to be here again on this stage a few years after I was able to give the talk myself. Now, as you all know, Humanists UK's annual lecture series has spanned over 7 decades, and this event, the Darwin Day Lecture, is certainly the highlight of the year. Darwin Day Lecture lecturers include Professor Sir David King, Dr. Adam Rutherford, Dr. Eugenie Scott, Professor Alice Roberts, and as Andrew mentioned, and myself. I was really delighted to be invited to give this lecture in 2023, and I'm even more excited to be invited to chair tonight's event with Humanists UK Vice President Professor Jim Al-Khalili. Now, I'm sure you all know this, but Jim Al-Khalili is an academic, author, broadcaster, and one of the UK's best-known science communicators. He's familiar to all of us as the host of the long-running BBC Radio 4 program, The Life Scientific. And as an academic, Jim is a quantum physicist at the University of Surrey, where he is a distinguished professor emeritus. He received his PhD in theoretical physics in 1989 and has published over 150 papers in the field. As well as these 150 papers, which is quite a feat in itself, he has written 15 books on popular science and the history of science, between them translated in 26 languages. His book on medieval Arabic science, Pathfinders, known as the House of Wisdom in the US, was shortlisted for the Warwick Prize, and his 2020 book, The World According to Physics, was shortlisted for the Royal Society Book Prize. Many people will also know him from the many TV science documentaries he has hosted over the past 2 decades, such as Atom, Shock and Awe, The Story of Electricity, Everything and Nothing, and the BAFTA-nominated Chemistry of Volatile History. Now, Jim is a past president of both the British Science Association and Humanists UK, and of course he is now a vice president of Humanists UK. And he is a recipient of the Royal Society's Michael Faraday Medal, the Wilkins-Brunel Medawar Medal, the Institute of Physics Kelvin Medal, and the Stephen Hawking Medal. And of course, as we will later discuss, the Darwin Day Medal. He has received honorary doctorates from 9 universities and is a fellow of the Royal Society, an honorary fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering, the Institute of Physics, and the Institution of Engineering and Technology. He received an OBE from the Queen in 2007 and a CBE in 2021, both for services to science and public engagement in STEM. Clearly, we are very lucky to have Jim here with us tonight, so please welcome Professor Jim Al-Khalili to the 2025 Darwin Day Lecture. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Anjali, for that rather long and squirmy introduction, but I appreciate it. Good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. I mean, I have to start off, obviously, by saying, so Anjali is far more expert in the subject matter that I'm going to be talking about tonight, and there probably is quite a few people in the audience who know more about it than I do. It's an honor to be getting the Darwin Lecture medal, because as a quantum physicist, what do I know about evolution theory, really? I mean, it's all rather embarrassing. Now, the reason why I feel justified in telling you the story and giving the lecture this evening is, it was quite delicate, because I've just finished filming a 2-part series, Horizon Special for BBC 2, on this subject, the evolution of the human brain. And it doesn't go out until later this year. So, of course, the BBC, understandably, were worried that I was going to be giving too many spoilers in this lecture. But it does mean that I've learnt quite a bit along the way. So what I'm going to share with you is not the expert opinion of an academic working in the field, but some guy who talked to lots of people who know stuff and put it into some slides to tell this particular story. So I hope you enjoy it. Our brains have evolved, or the brain has evolved over the course of evolutionary history. So essentially, the evolution of the human brain is really the story of Darwinian evolution, going back to the very origins of life. And so it was forged across eons thanks to catastrophes, extinction events, competition for resources, love, sex, death. It's a tremendous story of how and why we got to have these wonderful, complex systems, the most complex thing in the known universe, the human brain. One of the nice things about the program was I got to have my brain scanned, an MRI. Actually, it does appear the program. The guy, I have to tell you this because I dine out on this quite regularly. The guy who scanned my brain said, "Jim, you have a beautiful brain." He also said, "You have the brain of a much younger man," which of course then, I get the comment, "Well, you better give it back to him then." That's because it's hardly ever been used. But I don't care. And in fact, having scanned my brain, then they made a sort of 3D printed model of it that I carry around throughout the program. And I still have it now at home, pride of place. 20 years ago, it was my first TV, I made a documentary about this brain. This is the brain of Albert Einstein. When he died in 1955, the pathologist, Thomas Harvey, who carried out the autopsy, removed the brain and didn't put it back into the body, kept it in the hope that he could collaborate with some other neuroscientists and maybe figure out what made Einstein such a genius. Well, that was clicking forward, wasn't it? Of course, he didn't find out what made Einstein a genius. You need a sample of more than one to see what differences that brain had compared with other brains. But there are lots of stats about the human brain that make it such a remarkable object. Why is that jumping? I'm not touching it. Brain power, thank you. Yeah, someone's on the ball. I like these analogies. There are roughly as many cells in the human brain as there are stars in the galaxy, over 100 billion. Each cell is connected on average to 1,000 other cells. This is a neural net making 100 trillion connections. 160,000 kilometers of wiring, neurons, if you think of them as wires that conduct electric signals. You lay them end to end, they stretch halfway to the moon. There's a reason why we haven't developed AI yet that shows artificial general intelligence. The human brain is far too complicated for any machine to be able to emulate just yet. And so, I want to talk about the evolution of the human brain in 8 chapters. I can just about see the clock there, so I want to make sure I stick to time. I haven't rehearsed this lecture, so I'll see if I have to speed up towards the end. These are moments in evolutionary history, mostly, where there's been some event or some period that caused a dramatic change in the way the brain evolved. The first chapter is essentially the evolution of the eye. The eye appeared before the brain. There were creatures that had eyes before there were creatures that had brains. And this takes us all the way back to a very early period in history called the Ediacaran period, over 600 or so million years ago. Very rudimentary creatures, of course, at that time, all life lived in the oceans, in the sea, and evolutionary biologists have found a way of trying to understand and study what those creatures would have been like, because there are creatures that are around today, very rudimentary, that have very rudimentary sensitivity to light that we can study. So, for example, the ragworm that lives in the oceans, for example, in the Mediterranean, has very similar features to these early creatures that lived many hundreds of millions of years ago. They have very rudimentary eyes. They don't have a brain. They have a very rudimentary data processing system that can analyze the light that is captured. All they need to know is the difference between day and night, and of course how deep they're swimming in the ocean, because that tells them where to find the food, the plankton that they feed on. And this sort of rudimentary eye that that first evolved didn't really change for hundreds of millions of years. The Platanarus, this ragworm, is interesting. It has 4 what we would call eyes. These are just pigments. They capture a photon, and the molecule that captures the photon changes shape, and that sends a signal that is data processed and gives it information about how deep it is in the water. So this is long before a brain evolved. Those creatures were so simple, they didn't need to know much about their surroundings, much about their environment. They just needed very simple information. The data processing, of course, gradually gets more and more complex as they develop other senses, as they develop motion, as they have to move away from predators or search for food. To develop more complicated data processing, the system that analyzes data has to be able to communicate. There have to be connections. And so at some point, axons and neurons evolved, even before where there was something that we could say, this is a brain, just a data processing center. The axon, the story of how that was discovered and studied goes back to the 19th century. A German Darwinist by the name of Anton Dorn built the Stazione Zoologica in Naples. And it was there that they studied a lot of the marine creatures off the coast of Naples in the Mediterranean. And the most famous scientist who worked there was J.Z. Young, who in the first half of the 20th century was studying the neural system of squid and octopus. And what he discovered was these giant, long, thick nerve cells. So the nerve cell, the axon, the connection between the neurons is tiny. But in the squid, there are these long nerve cells that conduct electricity, that send signals from one part of the body to the other. And that was the first hint that this is how the cells within the brain can communicate with each other and connect. He certainly influenced other scientists, Andrew Huxley, Alan Hodgson, who won the Nobel Prize for their discoveries concerning the mechanisms of the connections between the neurons. I had to try and sort of neuroscience 101 figure out the physics behind it. And these action potentials where you allow for positively charged ions to get through into the axon, and they move along from carrying an electric signal from one neuron to the other. We now know that this is the way the neurons in our brains send signals, and they all connect together. But going back hundreds of millions of years, the connections were very simple. If we go back to the period 500 to 600 million years ago, creatures all still lived in the sea. They were slowly developing basic senses, sense of smell, sight, basic motor, motion, actions. There were basic chemicals, peptides that were controlling their behavior. But there was still very, very basic data processing. They still didn't have brains as we would think of them today. Then, of course, we have this, about 530 million years ago, we see this incredible event, the Cambrian explosion. No one quite understands why it happens. Well, I mean, maybe there are those evolutionary biologists that know more than I do about it, but as far as I can tell, people aren't quite sure why it happened. There was this sudden proliferation of life. Maybe because suddenly there was more competition for resources, but life suddenly branched out and lots of different creatures emerged and evolved. Some of them developed things like spines, and you see the emergence of the first vertebrates. If you have a spine, you have a spinal cord. If you have a spinal cord, the end of it is what eventually evolves into the brain. If they're vertebrates, they can swim faster, so they can escape predators, or they can hunt for food themselves. And so all of these things help these creatures evolve very, very quickly. They become bilateral in the sense of left-right symmetry, which also helps them navigate, escape from predators and so on. Very soon after the Cambrian explosion, creatures start to emerge onto the land. Of course, so this happens round about, this is in the Paleozoic era, between 400 and 500 million years ago, and something remarkable happens there, because just in terms of vision, what you can see in water, you can see, creatures could see 1 or 2 or 3 meters distance around them. They come up into the land and suddenly there's so much more information to absorb visually. Their brains have to keep up. Their data processing has to accelerate and keep up with being able to understand all this information that's coming in. The earliest creatures that emerge out of the water are sort of algae and mosses and then plants. What is remarkable is before the Cambrian explosion, there is no life on the land. There's nothing. All life is in the sea. Then you start to get insects and small animals starting to evolve on the land. This carries on for the next 200 million years. They get smarter, they get quicker, their brains evolve, until about 250 million years ago, when you get a rather terrible event taking place. This is known as the Permian-Triassic extinction event. Roughly 95% of all life on Earth is extinguished. Essentially, volcanoes erupt, they spill out chemicals, you get acid rain, you get increase in carbon dioxide. We talk about carbon dioxide in the air, how many, 400 or so parts per million in the air, and that's leading to the climate crisis. Back then it was something like, several thousand, up to 5,000 parts per million carbon dioxide. So it's not surprising that animals found it very hard to survive. But some life did, and life did emerge again. And this leads to this lovely story, we cover this in the program, the story of Morganucodon, or Morgie. Say something about the human brain before I move on. We need to understand the origins of the neocortex. The neocortex is the main part of our brain. It's like 3/4 by volume of our brain. It's responsible for the higher order thinking functions, language, perception, decision making, and it's the most recently evolved part of the brain. But most interestingly, it's only found in mammals. Other animals, think about some certain birds that can be smart. Well, they don't have a neocortex, but they have other. Their brains evolved in a different way to allow them to be clever. Now, this creature, Morgie, is interesting because it somehow stood apart from other animals at the time. It lived about 200 million years ago. It had a bigger brain than other creatures, but its brain was a different shape. It had a weird bump at the top of the brain. Some think it was an early mammal, but probably more correctly, it was a precursor to mammals. It's a shrew-like creature, 2 or 3 centimeters long. Fossils were found in China, and also in Glamorgan in South Wales. They found fossilized skulls. They could do a CT scan on that and fill in the cavity and say, well, that's where the brain was. And what they found was a bump, which is believed to be the very earliest neocortex, this part of the brain that is so important for humans. Why did this particular creature evolve this bump on its brain? Well, there are two bits of evidence, and it took me a while to get my head around what they were telling us. But essentially, scans of the fossilized bones of Morgie showed that there were these canals this is in the reconstructed femur, that would have been blood vessels. More blood vessels in the bones suggested more blood circulation, which suggested a higher metabolic rate. They needed more food. Similarly, there's a fossilized jawbone of Morgie, which has been very conveniently enlarged there and 3D printed. And what you see is two sets of teeth. So Morganucodon was one of the first creatures to have both adult and baby teeth. Well, that means it was suckling milk from its mother, like mammals do. That's just why people think of it as an early mammal. It was becoming warm-blooded. And that's the important thing about it. This evidence suggests that Morgie was one of the earliest warm-blooded creatures, which means it needed more food, which means it had to go and hunt. It had to eat more. It had to go and probably go and hunting nocturnally as well, which means it had to be cleverer. It had to evade predators. It had to find its food. So the fact that it was warm-blooded, the fact that it had this higher metabolic rate suggested it needed to be smarter, and its brain had to keep up. It had to evolve more quickly. Okay, I now jump forward another, 100 or so million years. I want to whiz through the Jurassic and the Cretaceous periods. It's another extinction event, the very famous one, 65 million years ago, that wiped out the dinosaurs. So an asteroid hits the Earth in what's now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. It doesn't wipe out as many creatures as the previous extinction event, but 70% of all life, including the poor dinosaurs, all disappear. Again, certain creatures, those that can hide and burrow underground and still find food and live under a harsh environment, survive and evolve. One of them is this what's called the Plesiadapiform. About 60 million years ago, thought to be the ancestor of all primates. It doesn't much look like a primate. It was a small mammal. It appears in the fossil records around about this time. The artist's impression here shows it has claws, but it's thought that either it or other early mammals around that time evolved fingernails instead of claws. They didn't need the claws, they needed fingernails, which made them more dexterous. It meant if they were hunting for fruit, they could reach out and grab the fruit off the tree more easily. They better balance. They also had a very good sense of smell. So here's the skull of Plesiadapiform. Again, a rather small creature. And CT scans of the skull suggest its brain would have looked rather strange. It had a bit at the front, which these are the very enlarged olfactory bulbs, smell, which of course suggests that it was probably nocturnal. It relied on smell to find its food. But like Morgie, it has this developed neocortex at the top of its brain. So this was the precursor to primates. And primates' brains, we talk about human brain being much bigger than chimpanzees or gorillas. Actually, if you think about all mammals, if you plot a graph of brain weight against body weight, they all pretty much fall on a line. You think of all these, well, I suppose the higher up it is, the ratio, the greater the ratio of brain weight to body weight. So certainly bands there, but so is the dolphin and the chimpanzee and the rhesus monkey. Size isn't everything, but there are other reasons why primates evolved and why humans then took over and overtook other primates. So this leads to, this was chapter 7 of 8. And I'm doing very well with time. If we think about the evolution of early humans from our primate ancestors, what was it that helped? This is sort of a well-known, well-trodden story. So this is something that sort of I think a lot of people are familiar with. I wasn't familiar with the story of Morganukadon, for example. But certainly in terms of humans, or even early ancestors of humans, becoming bipedal, coming out of the forests was important. Already, primates who lived up in the canopy, in the rainforests, needed to develop certain skills to hunt for fruit, to evade the snake that's sort of crawling on the next branch, to find their way through the canopy to reach their food, and so on. But becoming bipedal, standing up and walking on two legs, was helpful because it meant your other limbs were free to do other things, like, for example, start developing tools. It also helped that they then needed to start planning, thinking how are they going to find their food, how to solve problems. Famously, we say, well, humans became more intelligent because, of course, we developed language. What I found interesting in the making of this series is that it's not so much the language that's important, it's developing syntax, the ordering, logically putting these thoughts in order. Animals that use hand gestures are using the same part of the brain that we do when we speak. So putting things in order, the syntax, the grammar, whether it's of physical gestures, is just as important as the grammar, the syntax of language. But of course, once we develop language, then of course we can develop ideas much more quickly and efficiently, and human culture evolves. Metacognition is something that evolved in the higher primates. This is the idea that you know what you know what you don't know. It's linked to the theory of mind, which is, you put yourself in the other person's shoes, see the world from a different perspective. Awareness of others' ability to think. And it's still to some extent being debated as to what other animals have theory of mind, whether it's chimpanzees and gorillas, or even whether certain birds like crows have theory of mind. But of course, what I found most interesting was the idea that social interactions was also important in helping evolve the human brain. And so this brings me to the final chapter and the theory of the social brain. This is the idea that it's because the reason primates have larger brains is because they live in larger social groups. They have to interact. They have to manage the complex social systems that they live in. Having a social, it doesn't mean that an extrovert is more intelligent than an introvert. This is something broader. It's about the evolution of the brain of primates and of humans had, to a large extent, depended on the fact that we were social creatures, that we interacted with each other. And I want to show you an example of what I mean by this, why it's important, by doing this cognitive test with you. It's actually quite hard to solve. I got it wrong, so don't feel embarrassed. I sort of big-headedly thought, wow, it's going to be really easy, and of course I got it wrong. 90% of people who try the test get it wrong. okay? So, but the reason for that is because it's abstract. So let me run through it carefully. You may have seen this before. You have 4 cards. Each of the 4 cards has a number on one side and a color on the other. You have odd and even numbers, and the colors are blue and red. And the question is this: what card or cards do you turn over to check whether that statement is true? If the number is even, then the color on the on the back is blue. I'll give you a few seconds to think about that. What cards do you have to turn over to test this statement, to make sure the statement is true? You've probably all got it now, haven't you? Okay. There's another version of this test I'll show you in a moment, which I assure you is a lot easier, but it's the same test. The answer here, to put you out of your misery, is that you'd have to turn over the 8 and the red. Say, I got it wrong. You see, there's no point turning the 3 over. It could be blue, it could be red. That doesn't help me with my hypothesis. And the same with the blue. If it's even, then blue. It's not if it's blue, then it's even. So I have to turn the 8 over to make sure there's blue on the back. That's the card that I have to check to turn over to check. And I've got to turn the red over to make sure it doesn't have an even number on the back. It's a bit weird, and it probably involves, you have to sit down and think about this. So here's another version of it, which is to do with this idea that we are social creatures. So the numbers here are age. So you're a pub landlord, and you have a 16 and a 25, and you have a non-alcoholic soda, and you have a beer. What cards do you have to turn over to make sure you're not breaking the law? Or the clientele in your pub are not underage drinkers. So now, hopefully, you can see that it makes a lot of sense. Well, I want to check that the youngster isn't drinking beer, right? So I've got to turn that one over. I don't care if the 25-year-old decides they want to have a Coke or not. They can drink Coke if they want. I don't need to turn that over. It's not going to help, decide whether they break the law or not. I don't have to turn the soda card over either, because it doesn't matter if you're overage or underage. But I want to turn the beer card over to make sure there's no 16 on the back, to make sure there's no underage drinker. That makes so much more sense. It's so much easier to understand. And psychologists argue, and those who work in this the social brain theory, argue that the reason this is easier is because we are more used to dealing with these problems as a social animal, rather than as an abstract idea. So our brains are more familiar with them. So it could be that one of the reasons why the higher primates evolved larger brains and overtook other mammals is because they have this complicated social interaction, complex interaction with each other in larger groups and societies. Well, in the program, I don't go much beyond this, but I wanted to say a bit more in this lecture, because I think there's more to say about where we go from here. And of course, a question that I'm certainly interested in is what's next. The human brain, well, certainly in terms of evolution, the human brain, very often people think, well, we are the ultimate, with the culmination, the end of evolution. Well, we're just part of that journey. Who knows how brains and life will evolve into the future. Of course, the difference is now that we have technology intervening to speed things up or change direction. So the big question is, will AI ever be created? It's outside of Darwin and evolution now, but can we ever create artificial intelligence that is as intelligent as humans, or even exceeding human abilities? What's called artificial general intelligence. And if so, does this mean, if we do get there, does this mean AI will become sentient, self-aware, conscious? And it leads to this question of what it is that we mean by consciousness. It's interesting when we use these large language models like ChatGPT. It's freakishly clever, sounds freakish. It seems as though you're talking with it and it's making sense and it's giving you the answers that you want, and AI is even showing sort of rudimentary creativity. But it's not conscious. It's just an algorithm. It's just predicting what it should say next, depending on the previous word that it said, by analyzing the data that's out there on the internet. I always say that AI isn't, if you're having a conversation with a large language model and then you leave it in mid-discussion and go off on holiday for a week, ChatGPT is not sitting there going, oh, well, where did Jim go? I was quite interested in that. Oh, I miss him. But your dog misses you when you go away. Your dog is conscious. It may not have the higher processing power that a human does, but it has the same, all the higher level thinking processes, the emotions. Your dog can feel guilty if it's been naughty. It can be happy, sad, jealous. A dog is conscious. A cat is conscious. Is a mouse conscious? Probably. What about an ant? No. Well, I mean, where is the dividing line? Well, see, consciousness isn't a flick of a switch. Consciousness is a dimmer switch. Gradually appears. And consciousness would have evolved, and sentience would have evolved with the evolution of the brain. The more sophisticated the brain was, the brighter that light of self-awareness, of consciousness would have been. Will AI ever become conscious? I see no reason why not. There's nothing magical about the brain. Although it's the most complex system in the universe, it's not like it's just a lot of biological sort of software, and then you sprinkle pixie dust on it and it suddenly becomes self-aware. Biology is ultimately just chemistry and physics. There's no vitalist magical spark to life. We may not understand enough about it, but there isn't any magic involved. And there's no reason that I have ever seen to why AI couldn't one day, a long time from now, it's not going to happen next year, despite what some people might think, develop what we call AGI, artificial general intelligence, and be sentient and be self-aware. There's no reason why it should think like a human. I mean, why should it? Self-aware, I mean, why would we build it in our image anyway? Max Tegmark, who is a cosmologist, he's now been working in AI for some years. He says the real worry with advanced AI is not malevolence, but incompetence. And the real worry we should have about AI is not that they're going to take over the world and turn us all into paper clips. It's not the Terminator scenario. It's that AI is going to change the way we live, change the way we work. In the wrong hands, it could be terrible because it's still under the control of humans. So it's still saying that AI is not going to be conscious for a long time doesn't mean we shouldn't be concerned about AI. I want to say the last thing I wanted to talk about was whether the human brain can be a quantum computer. I mean, I'm a quantum physicist, so I'm trying to sort of link it to something I know a little bit about. There have been suggestions that what is different about the brain is that it computes in a way that a normal computer can't do. And that extra thing that it does is what we would expect a quantum computer to do once we build one. We're sort of already on the way to building rudimentary quantum computers. They don't do anything particularly impressive just yet. We'll know when they do, when you're told not to put your credit card details online, because a quantum computer can decrypt the encryption key. That essentially the reason why it's safe to put our credit card details online is because it sort of multiplies two very large numbers together, and it's really hard to work out starting from the end and say what two numbers multiplied together give you this number. Factorizing is really difficult. A quantum computer would be able to do that more easily, and so at that point, we should be worried. But we're not there yet. But whether the brain behaves quantum mechanically or not, again, it might do, but we're a long way from being able to answer that question. Some decades ago, the physicist Roger Penrose, together with Stuart Hameroff, published work suggesting that the brain behaves quantum mechanically, that consciousness is because of the collapse of a quantum superposition of molecules inside the brain. It's appealing and it's fun, and a lot of people got quite excited about it at the time, but very quickly it was realized that just because the consciousness is mysterious and quantum mechanics is mysterious doesn't mean the two are connected. They may be, but let's not run before we can walk. Probably too soon to tell whether the brain behaves in a way that a quantum computer would behave. I want to end just by saying a few words about what it is so I'm a physicalist in the sense that I believe that I can explain the world around me using rational laws of physics and chemistry and biology. There's nothing magical or extra. And I'm also a humanist, but I'm not a sort of human exceptionalist that somehow we are more special than, so much more special than other animals that we share this planet with. But certainly what makes us human, what defines us as humans, is something that I think of as a humanist, is more than just how our brains are connected, more than the fact that our brains are the most sophisticated brains in all life on Earth. It's more than our intelligence, it's more than our intuition or creativity. I think one day AI will replicate that, but that doesn't make AI human. What makes us human is not just the social brain theory, but our interactions with each other, the complex societies and cultures that we form. It's our shared history, our shared memory, our shared cultures. That's what makes us human, far more, I think, than the number of neural connections in our brain, or how long, if you stretch the neurons end to end, how far it goes towards the moon. The human brain is unique for reasons beyond just the complexity and its ability to data process. And I think I will end there, so thank you all very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That was incredible. And
did I get anything wrong?
No.
Okay.
There are a few things.
There were bits, I mean, and the audience will know this, and my wife will point this out to me. There are bits he said, you just didn't know what you were saying, did you? You'd forgotten. You didn't know, you were just floundering, looking for the right word.
Well, there were a few things that you mentioned. I thought, I just spoke to somebody about this last week and learned about various things about, why, maybe, ideas, why life suddenly took off when it did, and what that has to do with the atmosphere and the ozone layer and things like that. But it's all still very unknown. I kind of wanted to start with where you ended, because I've dabbled in brain evolution over the years, and I tend to quantify how it's changed, but I shy away from the things that you were talking about, in large part because they're hard to measure and they're hard to understand. Things like intelligence and culture and self-awareness. I heard somebody gasp behind me, actually, when you said that ants were not self-aware. So I wondered if you could share more about your thoughts about that, actually. How does brain size or brain development, evolution, relate to kinds of those intangibles?
Yeah, I mean, I think with ants, I would like to think of ant colonies as having some collective intelligence or awareness.
Hive mind.
But that's an emergent quality.
Okay.
An individual ant is rather simple in its data processing ability. But lots of ants together, they will coordinate their activities. They will, to hunt for food, to defend their home, and so on. So I don't think of an ant as being conscious. Well, certainly it's not self-aware. I mean, as I mentioned, for me, consciousness is a dimmer switch, so it hadn't turned completely off for an ant. Otherwise, you can't get collective intelligence out of adding up lots of zeros. So it must be finite in some sense, but I wouldn't. Maybe this is a personal view. I don't think of ants as self-aware, but there's no line to draw. They say, on one side they're not conscious, on the other side they are.
Yeah, it's not like at the beginning of fish, all of a sudden
Right.
they're self-aware. Now, like I said, these are questions that I find really hard to understand, actually, because it is so driven by our human experience, right? And our slight obsession, I would say, at sometimes, because, I know you said you're not a human exceptionalist, but of course, one of the most outstanding things about humans are our giant brains, right?
Yeah.
They really set us apart. And so it is interesting when we try and back away from where we are as kind of very large-brained species to other species that are either still respectably brained or not so respectably brained. How does that kind of dismantle what we think of as forming kind of our unique identity as a species? And so that's why I wanted to just kind of talk about that specifically, in where you see those lines. But also, I thought what you said about, kind of dogs versus AI is actually a really great example there of, what is significant about an individual species. And one thing I would think about with the AI is whether or not it can generate something new, right? I think dogs can do something new. I mean, I have a dog who does something crazy every single day. Do you think AI will ever be able to do, I think, what's really special about humans, which is really create new things?
Well, I mean, I think AI is already developing art and music that is different, it's new.
Not good, though, right?
Well, no, it's not good yet, but it's still, I would still define that as creativity. I see no reason why not. I don't think, there's the idea that there was a science fiction writer, I forget his name, Canadian, Robert something or other. Anyway, he wrote this great book about how not all humans are self-aware, that some fraction of humanity are basically zombies. They respond in the way that you'd expect them to respond. So you can't tell talking to someone whether they're a zombie or a self-aware human. And I found that very interesting because but people say, well, AI could evolve so that it does everything that you'd expect it to do if it were sentient, if it were conscious and self-aware, but it's still dead inside. But I'm not quite sure what that means. It's not about passing. There's the famous the Turing test, where if you ask something hidden in a box questions and it responds in the way that you're convinced that's a human, then it's conscious. No, I don't think. I think already ChatGPT, I guess, passes the Turing test. But I don't see why there might be something other special in a living brain, like whether it's a human or a dog, that couldn't emerge artificially. It's not copying it, it's not replicating it. It will be doing the same things that we're doing in terms of being conscious.
And developing new ideas.
And why not? Yes, yeah, I don't see why not.
It's interesting that you said you don't think it'll happen next year, but don't you feel like it's sort of unpredictable, the the rate at which these things are growing? Or do you feel like it is entirely
Oh
predictable?
no, absolutely. I think it's scary just how fast it's evolving. But when I hear people talking about, well, in a year or two we'll have artificial general intelligence, that's rubbish.
Yeah.
It really is rubbish. It's not in the next year or two. Yeah, I mean, it's going to be clever and it's going to be fooling us. It's going to be something we have to worry about in terms of developing, deep fake videos and so on. So it's scary and we need to be aware of it. And we presume we're going to have driverless cars. They're going to be far safer than human-driven cars. Fine. But that's a long way from saying it's self-aware and conscious.
Right.
Which is not to say that we won't get there one day.
Which is, I suppose, where it becomes an independent threat as opposed to just a more powerful tool for human actors, as you said.
Yes.
So we use AI quite a lot in my lab, and I sometimes do, it's kind of cruel, I don't think any of my lab members are watching, so a little bit of an experiment where sometimes I'll ask ChatGPT a question at the same time that I ask my postdocs a question, see who gets the answer first. So far, it's always my postdocs. But it's probably just because I don't know how to ask the right questions yet.
I worried about ChatGPT, so I've just finished, stopped teaching a course to first-year undergraduates on relativity theory that I've taught on and off for 30 years. And I'd always set my students an essay coursework, 1,500 words on some big discovery or landmark or person in the history of astronomy and cosmology. And 2 years ago, whatever it was, a few months after ChatGPT emerged, I had to amend their honesty statement where they had to say, I promise not to use AI to help me writing my essay, which is something that educationists are really, have been concerned about. Despite that, about a third of the students used ChatGPT. And we know this because back then there was another algorithm called GPT-0, which would test. You'd send the essay through it, and it'll say, yeah, there's a whatever high percentage chance that this paragraph was written by AI. So we knew they were getting help from ChatGPT, but we didn't have a mechanism to, how do you penalize them for that? You could just say, well, no, that's how I write, prove it, and you can't. So the following year, which was the last year I taught the course, I changed it, and I said, the coursework is write a prompt to get ChatGPT to write a 500-word essay and then critique that essay and say how you would improve it. Check the references, what would you add to make it better? And that forced them to think about... I don't know whether the academic who's taken over the course from me is going to use that same trick. Or he probably just remove that piece of coursework altogether. Too much of a headache.
I do think that's a way better way of getting people to engage with it, right? Otherwise, it's just easy to use as a crutch and not even bother understanding it. So going back to kind of brain evolution, though, one thing that you touched on a bit is kind of the limitations on brains, right, in terms of the energy cost of brains. And, mammals, obviously, you said birds obviously do it a little bit differently, but you have a couple of these really big-brained groups that have evolved. And I think before we came out, I mentioned that a lot of my feelings about brain evolution have been biased by the fact that I've birthed human children, and big brains just feel like not really worth it at some level. Some of you may feel the same way. Do you think that there are any, other than, I guess, childbearing or childbirth mortality rates, do you think there are any real constraints on brain evolution, or do you think there is a constant drive for it, thinking about kind of human evolution?
Well, I certainly think the thinking like a physicist, the energy costs are hugely important. The brain needs so much energy to function, and that certainly drove evolution, which is one of the reasons why we talk about warm-blooded creatures. The higher metabolic rate, they needed more food. And part of the reason why they needed more food, more energy, was to feed this growing brain. It's sort of like, it's a cycle. If you need to hunt for food day and night and need to feed yourself more regularly, you need to be smarter. If you're smarter, you need a bigger brain to process all that data. If you have a bigger brain, it's more expensive energetically, so you need more food. So it certainly, because it's expensive to run, it needs to have a certain amount of energy to keep it going.
So it's fundamentally resource limited.
Absolutely, yeah.
That is also, I love that story in terms of the mammal evolution in the Mesozoic and how brains tie in with all of this, because it is, as a paleontologist, we work with so little data, right? We don't get to directly observe any of these things that were living hundreds of millions of years ago. And so when you can take something that is, a soft tissue structure and tie it into things like metabolism and lifestyle and competition and activity, you get so much more information. And I think that is just an amazing example of how, with just a little bit of information, you can undo this whole puzzle.
I found that slightly uncomfortable in the film, because as a physicist, I'm used to, you have a theory, you go and do an experiment, and you smash particles together, or you bounce light off mirrors, or and you can test your idea. In paleontology, it's really difficult. You develop a narrative and say, well, it might be because of this. This is the reason why. And certainly with creatures like Plesiadapiforms, where there are so few fossil remains of some of those early creatures, 50 or so million years ago, that it's slim pickings, and you have to try and piece together a story. So the idea that from a little bit of fossilized skull, you can put it under CT scan and figure out what shape the brain had, and it had these large olfactory bulbs at the front. Oh, okay, so it had a very developed sense of smell. That means it must have foraged for food at night, which means it had to be really smart.
Yeah, or a little piece of jawbone with 2 teeth in it, and you're like, okay, now this is a change in life history. It's funny, when you said earlier that biology is just chemistry and physics, in my head I thought, well, we have much bigger error bars. That's really the difference. Our error bars are huge. I think for the origin of mammals, I know the error bars I routinely deal with are plus or minus 30 million years in some cases.
Yeah. When I say, I never use the word just when I say biology just, because biology is much harder than chemistry, and chemistry is much harder than physics. I mean, neuroscience is even harder, and don't get me started on immunology. Physics is so much easier than all those subjects. It's one equation, and it basically explains all the laws of nature. So,
and then if you want to get very tricky, you get into the humanities.
Oh, well, forget it. That's so messy. I wouldn't even, How do you make progress in that?
Which is why I stay away from culture. It's far too complicated. I think at this point we should ask some questions of our audience. So just some rules of engagement here. We're going to move on to audience questions from in the room, but also online. So there are 3 staff walking around with microphones. If you are chosen to ask a question, please wait for the microphone before asking so that everyone can hear, including online. And when you do get the microphone, please hold it very close to your mouth, as though it was an ice cream cone that you were about to lick, but please do not lick the microphone. This does not need to be the start of the next pandemic. But, just pretend it's a big ice cream cone that you're enjoying. And if you're watching from home, please enter your questions into the chat box, and staff in the room with microphones will then be able to read them out when we come to that a little later on. So with that, do we have any questions from the audience? Yes, maybe just up here?
I have to say, I should explain the reason why I'm using a microphone is because apparently there's a problem with my radio mic, which is why I had to stand at the lectern, and now I'm holding this. Just why you wonder, why you've got a microphone, why are you holding that up? I was told I had to do this.
Just for the stereo effect.
I was just interested, are there any theories about future evolutions of the human brain?
I think all bets are off because we've evolved to the point where we have technology, and we can use technology to short-circuit evolution. We don't have to wait for the human brain to evolve and develop even further. Technology is going to replace that. Whether we're going to be cyborgs or whatever, or use computers to do all the thinking for us so that we don't have to think. So it may well be that we devolve because we don't need to be so smart anymore. I wonder sometimes, with the younger generation and attention spans. I'm just looking at the average age of the audience here, and I feel I'm on safe ground. But evolution. The story of the evolution of your brain is hundreds of millions of years. It's slow, but now that we have technology to enhance and improve our abilities, not just our, our mental abilities, but everything about about humans, then I think evolution no longer has much of a say. Would you agree?
No, I do agree. I think, especially with, kind of societies and things, we already likely had a slowdown with less selection, less kind of survival of the fittest with humans. I think, I had laser eye surgery 15 years ago. I was, near blind before that, and I certainly would not have survived to adulthood under normal kind of, circumstances, hundreds of thousands of years ago. So there's that release of pressure. But I do think what you were saying in terms of the reliance on AI, and I was wondering this when you were speaking earlier, if that will further reduce any sort of kind of selection on humans and just really slow down the pace of human evolution, which is okay. I mean, we like higher survivorship. That's not a bad thing.
Yeah, if we don't have to do all the deep thinking, then fine.
Exactly.
Let's, just
More
chill.
time to enjoy life.
Enjoy life, yeah.
Yep, maybe just over there.
You talked about the range of consciousness from humans, dogs, cats, ants. Is there any connection between that and free will? Do you think humans have free will? Do you think dogs have free will? Do you think ants have free will?
Free will is a whole nother subject. If you want my personal view on it, I'm what's called a compatibilist, which means, as a physicist, I believe we live in what's called a deterministic universe. That if we knew to infinite accuracy everything about the state of the universe now, we could, in principle, calculate and predict what would be happening next into the future. So, the future is sort of, in that sense, predetermined, if not predictable. But I still believe that within that deterministic universe, we have agency. We have freedom to make choices. Yes, after it's happened, you say, well, it was always going to be thus, you're always going to do that. But at the time, I think even if it's the illusion of free will, as far as I'm concerned, the illusion of free will is good enough. I call it free will. But I don't think that's connected to well, no, maybe it is connected to consciousness. I need to give it a bit more thought.
I actually have the completely opposite view.
Okay.
And this is a fierce debate within, I think, evolutionary biology. That if you reran the tape, if you go back, I don't know, let's say 1 billion years, I'd probably say after about 500, things are pretty locked in. Whether you would get the same result. And I would say probably not. You might get similarities. You get convergences, which I think are probably from kind of shared developmental patterns that have been laid down. But I think I'm not convinced that you'd get the same result. But if you started, if you started over from 1-2 billion years ago with kind of life on Earth.
Right. Well, are you talking about what we call, what we call in chaos theory the butterfly effect? That tiny.
I guess so.
Yeah. Well, so certainly a tiny variation at some moment in time would cause the universe ultimately to evolve very differently from it would have done had you not had that variation. But if you knew to infinite accuracy, then you could predict exactly what will happen into the future. Everything is subject to determined laws. And even quantum mechanics, which some would say, quantum mechanics rescues us from the stark determinism of the Newtonian world. That's a whole nother lecture, and I could talk about that with much more confidence, whether quantum mechanics says we live in a deterministic reality or not. But I believe it's still deterministic.
It's interesting. I saw some work recently where somebody was trying to identify whether the individuals in a population that tend to drive speciation by kind of moving into new environments, that they tend to be ones that have bolder behaviors, which I think is sort of free will in a sense in terms of boldness. And maybe that does fit in with your paradigm. But it's interesting. I haven't quite married those concepts in my head yet. I'll have to ponder.
Yeah, I have to say, I have changed my mind several times over the course of my career on this
free
matter.
will.
So yeah.
See, maybe just here on the aisle. And I will make sure to look upstairs.
Hello. Firstly, thank you for the lecture. May I ask what you think determines, or what is the best definition for self-consciousness or awareness? Because when you talk about awareness in dogs, that could be perceived as trainability. When you talk about them feeling missing us, for instance, that's almost Freudian in its object permanence. When you talk about them being afraid or worried or happy to see us, that's almost Pavlovian in its training, which is similar to perhaps how ants act. But when we have consciousness, self-consciousness, self-awareness, that's an entirely different thing from how we think about the emotions and trainability and perhaps self-preservation. So what do you think is the actual definition of being self-aware? Is it recognizing yourself in the mirror? Is it being able to see yourself in a pond and recognize who you are? I don't know what that actually is, and I'd be curious as to hear your thoughts.
Well, I think, at the risk of sounding like a solipsist, I might as well say that when I see that, being afraid or happy or something in another human, how do I know they're conscious? I'm assuming they are similar creatures to me. I know I'm self-aware. I'm aware of myself, my internal self. So I project that and assume other humans have that. And when I see it to a lesser extent in other mammals, like a pet dog, then I also project that consciousness on the dog and assume it would also, therefore, must be conscious. But I have no evidence that it's not just behaving in a way that, I expect it to behave as a mechanistical reaction to certain inputs.
Yep, just up here.
Thank you for the talk. How are we testing for quantum mechanics in the brain?
How are we testing for quantum mechanics? Well, we're not. So an area of research that I've been involved in for the last 15 or so years is called quantum biology. And that is looking for quantum effects inside living cells. And it's tough. It's really hard to do the experiments to test those theories. So down at the level of, for example, DNA and the hydrogen bonds that hold the two strands of DNA together, does that hydrogen bond behave quantum mechanically? And we can do calculations and we could do computer simulations. But even something simple like that is really hard to test in a lab. So testing whether a brain behaves quantum mechanically, I think we're miles away from being able to do an experiment to show that. It may be, Roger Penrose had some ideas about how the brain, some of the thought processes in the brain are what he called non-computable, that, you couldn't, a classical computer couldn't come to that, to find solutions to problems the same way that a brain could. Therefore, it had to be, if it's non-computable, then it must be down to a quantum computer. But no, I think we're a long way from being able to test those ideas. Not to say they're wrong, but we don't even know for sure down at the cellular level whether certain mechanisms inside the cell behave according to quantum mechanics or Newtonian, non-quantum mechanics yet.
But we'll get there, don't you think?
We'll get there,
all
yeah.
the increases in imaging and computing
Yeah,
power.
there are a number of candidates. One of the best examples is photosynthesis. Does photosynthesis rely on quantum effects? The very first stage in photosynthesis, when the chlorophyll molecule captures a photon of sunlight and delivers it to the reaction center in the cell to turn it into chemical energy, to build biomass, does that behave quantum mechanically? And there's been the suggestion, there have even been some experimental tests that hint at the idea that photon follows multiple paths simultaneously. And if in this famous quantum mechanics, what's called the two-slit experiment, you send a particle towards a screen with two slits in it, and it somehow goes through both slits at the same time.
it's in two places at once. This is the famous, quantum superposition. And the idea is that that happens inside living systems that photosynthesize. But there's still a big debate as to whether you can explain what you see using quantum mechanics or just normal classical vibrations. But I think we're moving towards being able to find experiments that can definitively answer that question. But quantum mechanics in the brain, we're a long way from that.
I think we should go up to the top here. I think there was a question over on this side that I saw earlier. I saw a hand up.
You talked about...
Sorry, I'm completely blinded by the light, so if you're up there, apologies, I don't know where you are, but sorry.
You talked about the energy limits on the growth of human brain. How do energy limits on brains compare with the energy limits on, or the energy used by artificial intelligence?
Well, one of the great things about evolution is that it seeks the most efficient way of doing something. Those brains that were more expensive energetically wouldn't have been able to compete with those brains that were more efficient energetically. If you need less food to survive and to flourish, then you're more likely to survive than if you need to constantly eat and put yourself in danger to be eaten yourself by predators. So the brains have evolved, even though they need a lot of energy, they've evolved to be very efficient in the use of that energy. Computers and AI and data processing systems are a long way from that. We're trying to make them more efficient, but they use a heck of a lot more energy than the brain, which is, orders of magnitude more complex. So yes, they're not very good yet.
It is actually pretty stunning, the amount of energy being used by AI data centers just within the last year or two, actually. So hopefully they will quickly increase in efficiency, or we will have some problems. Is there another one from up top? Sorry, I'm similarly somewhat blinded. Maybe over on this side I can see a hand up.
Yeah, there is a hand up. I can see you because you're out of the light.
I think you're blinded on this side, and I'm blinded on this side.
Thank you. Following on from your talk about energy and efficiency, it's my understanding, might be wrong, that essentially all animals from the ant to the upwards have essentially the same neuron. It's just a question of scale. The brain is large, and so things like consciousness have become an emergent thing from the scale. And if you look at artificial intelligence, at what point do you think will be the sort of the tipping point where, actually, large language models were a surprise to people in the field because it emerged at a certain point. At what point do you think we might emerge artificial general intelligence from a surprise at the scale as it just scales up?
I agree with you exactly that consciousness is an emergent property. There's, people who work in these fields, complexity theory, talk about weak emergence and strong emergence, and consciousness emerging is something called strong emergence, and it is to do with the connectivity. You're right, all creatures have neurons that connect, that send electric signals to each other, but it's the level of complexity, the number of connections between the neurons that leads to consciousness emerging. ChatGPT may be very clever at mining the data that's available on the internet and predicting what to say that makes sense, but it's still a very long way from having the trillions of interconnections between, even in artificial neural nets, we're a long way from being able to replicate anything that we could say is conscious. I mean, they're already... there's the Nobel Prize for Physics last year, and only recently the Queen Elizabeth Prize for Engineering was awarded to people working in machine learning and deep learning. The idea that you have these neural nets and you feed them information and they learn from that information and they develop something that emerges out of very simple instructions. But I think we're a long way yet from having anything that we'd call artificial general intelligence, simply because of the complexity of the neural connections in a large mammalian brain is vastly greater than anything we have artificially.
It's fairly stunning, actually, though, with just the recent kind of expansion of access to deep learning, right? And that's a fairly straightforward expansion of essentially these neural networks, right? But you see how much more applicable it is to different situations. So, once it starts to exceed kind of, or get into the same space as brains, I mean, it will be pretty stunning.
Yeah, I mean,
or scary.
I could be completely wrong. I mean, when I say, artificial general intelligence is way off, and then 5 years from now.
Right.
So yeah,
Next year's lecture.
don't take what I say as ultimate truth. I make things up as I go along.
Well, hopefully we're far away from the lecture being given by AI. Now, I think we should see if there are any questions from online, actually.
Hi there. Yeah, we've got James watching online who's asked, can you touch upon the evolution of compassion and empathy?
Oh. I mean, I guess ultimately, compassion and empathy, we'd regard them as evolved traits. You do unto others what you'd want done unto you, and don't do unto others what you wouldn't want done unto you is something that we would have evolved in order to survive. So I think cooperation is something that would have evolved, and compassion and empathy are more sophisticated versions of simple cooperation. Yeah. It sounds, or rather, sort of stark and cold and logical to talk about empathy and compassion as just having evolved, according to Darwinian evolution. But I think that's how it would have happened. I think that it's just another quality that would have evolved because it helped us survive better.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And you do see differences in rates of evolution in social species versus solitary ones and things like that. So it clearly has an impact on survivorship. Do you buy into this concept of, well, it sounds like maybe you do, that true altruism doesn't actually exist?
I had this discussion with a friend recently. I mean, I think he was talking about it from the perspective of, the reason we do good things is because we've been brought up in a religious environment, which that's a load of nonsense. You don't, the humanist creed is that, you don't need God to be good. Yeah. But the idea that, we don't have altruism, I think is nonsense. I think altruism, empathy, compassion are things that maybe I don't know whether they're uniquely human. Maybe in other animals there's some more sort of rough and ready version of them. But they evolved, but they are what define us, define humans. And I tend to still be optimistic that most humans do have that altruism. Acts of random kindness are not because we want to go to heaven. It's because we want to be nice, and I think that's part of the empathy that we've evolved as humans.
I mean, I guess going back to your kind of more kind of stark interpretation, maybe we do these things because we want to live in a functioning society, and we hope that somebody will do them to us if we ever need them, right? And it's sort of that give and take, as opposed to being never expecting it to benefit you in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's more cynical than I would like. I'm clearly, the audience here are more evolved than Donald Trump. Empathy and compassion and altruism are things that I think are a sign of a higher level of evolution. And
pretty sure the
and some people don't
evolved.
have that as well developed.
Yeah, it's a very low bar. Any more from online, or can we take more from the room? Okay, maybe one up here and then all the way up in the front.
If the Taliban ask you to go and give this presentation in Afghanistan, would you accept and would you attach any conditions to acceptance?
I've got a very simple answer. My wife wouldn't let me go. There are certain countries that I feel morally I wouldn't visit because of the ideological views held by, whether it's held by their government, you know. But you know, I don't. It's not out of because I don't think they would. Well, I suppose I am also a coward. I mean, I'm not quite sure it would be a wise thing to do. But no, I don't feel it's my role or duty to go and change their minds or preach to them or proselytize or tell them that the way they're thinking is wrong. But also, I would find it morally abhorrent to even visit countries like that.
Okay. And up here.
I liked your last slide where you gave your definition of being human by culture. I just want to probe that a tiny bit. How would you feel, hypothetically, suppose a rocket landed from far away and a bunch of creatures got out who were absolutely identical to humans. They had the same brains, the same cells, their mouths spoke in a similar way, although it would be a different language. They had a completely different culture and a different history. How are you going to feel about those? Do they fall within, would you treat them as humans, or would you treat them as computers who have managed to emulate intelligence?
Neither. I treat them as other sentient life forms. They are not humans because they haven't followed our evolutionary journey. But equally, I would, you know, if I, in the same way that other humans I would regard as being self-aware and sentient like me, and if these gave the impression they'd also developed culture and language and thought processes that similar to humans, then I would say they're sentient, intelligent aliens, but they're not human. Nor are they, of course, robots. So there's no reason why they shouldn't be regarded as being conscious and self-aware as well.
Presumably a bit advanced if they got here.
But exactly, that's right. They're more advanced than us, yeah.
Well, I would love to keep taking questions, but looking at the time, I think we should move on to the ceremony of the evening. And I should say that it is now my pleasure to present Jim with the Darwin Day Lecture Medal. And so Jim has been selected for this medal tonight in recognition of his amazing work transforming our understanding of unusual atomic nuclei with groundbreaking theoretical models, shedding light on the complex structure of matter, and for his well-known work advancing public understanding of science through acclaimed broadcasts and books, making exciting scientific advances and insights into our universe accessible and engaging, as we have seen tonight. And also for his longstanding and ongoing work promoting humanist values in society. So Jim's contributions truly embody the spirit of inquiry and education that the Darwin Day Medal celebrates. Congratulations, Jim.